And, one can draw parallels. When this whole situation first jumped off, you heard comments about Palestinians being animal, being uncivilized, barbaric even. And I see a parallel about how the powers of this world speak about the Palestinians and how they have spoken about African Americans for the last 400 plus years. Do you see a parallel like that?
Of course, there's a parallel, brother. When Zionism as a political ideology is very well connected to white supremacy, they think they have a God given right to usurp people's land. They have no respect for the indigenous people who was living on that land prior to their set colonial project. And all settler colonialism comes with this dehumanization.
Peace be unto you. This is C.L. Edwards. As a right wing Christian apologist, I felt everyone else was lost, but I was in darkness. But knowledge is light, and when you know better, you're supposed to do better.
He was heavily involved in apologetics, he was involved in ministry, he gave sermons, and now, subhanAllah, he is back as a Muslim.
So I created this podcast to fight against the misinformation, the ignorance, and the hate. So subscribe, like, and share, because we got a lot to talk about. Peace be unto you. This is C.L. Edwards, and you are viewing the C.L. Edwards podcast. I got a great show for you today. Something that I think is going to be both entertaining and informational. I have with me our brother, Hakeem Muhammad from the Black Dawa Network.
Assalamu alaikum, brother.
Wa alaikum salam.
Alhamdulillah.
So,
Thanks for having me on.
alhamdulillah, thank you for appearing. Let me just do a quick introduction of you, brother. This is Hakeem Muhammad. He's the president of the Black Dawa Network. He also is a attorney at law, well-educated black man, and a Muslim by faith, hailing from the south side of Chicago. And Chicago is the talk of the nation for the last maybe 10 years. It's been in pop culture a lot because of the gang situation that's going on in Chicago. So whether it's movies and documentaries about what goes on in Southside Chicago, or whether it's right wing pundits or those who are social media who like to bring up Southside Chicago anytime a discussion about systemic or racism is discussed or some racial incident. When are you guys going to do something about Southside Chicago? Is kind of tossed out there, but brother Hakeem has put together this incredible book in defense of Black America, where he systematically goes through many of the arguments that are hurled at Black America, and he basically gives them a Mike Tyson uppercut. uh, lays these arguments down on the mat. Now, with the situation that is going on in Gaza, um, there's been a lot of quotes from leading Black liberation figures like Malcolm X, brothers from the ancestors from the Black Panthers and whatnot. People using these quotes in support of the Palestinians, and we see this a lot from the Muslims as well. But the reality is that when brother Malcolm al Shabazz was alive and still here, and even after at the time of his death, that there was issues with the Muslim community in New York and the tri-state area about coming out to support him, coming out to do his janazah, showing support to the sister Betty Shabazz. And there's a tension going on that I see and I perceive between African American Muslims and the immigrant Muslims. And it shouldn't be that way because the Quran and the Sunnah gives us a perfect guide to alleviate this tension, but it still exists. So, brother, and it just shortly, could you tell us you're a Muslim? Why would you write a book like this? Being a Muslim, shouldn't you be concerned about going to the masjid, getting ready for Ramadan, which is in 2 months? Shouldn't you be concerned about establishing the salat and learning about akida and things like this? Why are you getting into these dunya issues like this? Why are you concerned about what the you're not among the kuffar. You're Muslim. Why are you concerned about what's going on in the black community?
Brother, it is precisely because I am a Muslim that I wrote this book in defense of Black America. We as Muslims have been enjoined in the Quran to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. What greater evil has been inflicted in the world for the past centuries than that of white supremacy, which has
Mm,
not only colonized the entire Muslim Ummah for historical periods, but is also white supremacy is also responsible for carrying out the transatlantic slave trade, which was a crime against humanity. How can we cannot have a discussion about preserving Islam without looking at the impact that white supremacy has had, even in terms of inhibiting the message of Islam? When black people were taken as slaves and brought to the Americas, many of them were Muslim, from Omar ibn Said to Ayubo Diallo. However, there were laws written on the books that said black people must be Christian, that they can
mm,
only practice the faith of Christianity. Any open expression of Islam was absolutely persecuted, and slave masters would have absolutely no respect for the religion of Islam. And this is why you had slaves, enslaved Africans from Omar ibn Said, who would escape the plantation just to pray. And so when the reason why this book had to be written is because today there continues to be stereotypes that are promoted against the African American community, and as Muslims we as Muslims are also taught that we've been put into nations and tribes in order to get to know one another. When white supremacy is reinforcing untrue stereotypes about African Americans, when white supremacy is spreading slander about African Americans, the rest of the world cannot properly get to know the African American people, because we as African Americans, we are a great people. We are a persevering people. We are an intelligent people, and we are a people who are hardworking, who are industrious. But white supremacy spreads lies, spreads slanders about the African American community that as a
mm.
Muslim, we have a duty to correct and to rectify.
Allahu Akbar. And, one can draw parallels between the landers that are made against the Palestinian people and other people in the Middle East. When this whole situation first jumped off, you heard comments about Palestinians being animal, being uncivilized, barbaric even. And I see a parallel about how the powers of this world speak about the Palestinians and how they have spoken about African Americans for the last 400 plus years. Do you see a parallel like that?
Of course, there's a parallel, brother. When Zionism as a political ideology is very well connected to white supremacy, they think they have a God given right to usurp people's land. They have no respect for the indigenous people who was living on that land prior to their colonial project. And all settler colonialism comes with this dehumanization. All
Mm.
the white supremacy comes with this dehumanization of indigenous people of color. And so I would say to the rest of the Muslim world, they need to be cognizant of the role that white supremacy is playing in the international world and geopolitics and the world community at large.
Allahu Akbar. It's my personal opinion, even though I'm the host, but I'm going to throw my personal opinion in real quickly, that white supremacy is the greatest example, or what's the word I'm looking for? The greatest shirk of our time, is the greatest polytheism of our time, even worse than the Trinity, because Europe, America is fastly becoming non-Christian areas. People are moving away from Christianity, but white supremacy is still in effect and hasn't gone anywhere. That's my personal view. So let me get into the questions. I'm going to get into the questions. And, for anyone out there who may see a tone in my questions, let me just tell you up front, I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, just to give, a couple of hardballs at the brother. I know he can handle it based on what I read from the book. And we want to bring up the common arguments and statements that you hear against African Americans, because I this information needs to be heard from by black people. We need to hear this because a lot of us have low self-esteem, and many of us, we've been brainwashed. We're going through 12 years of 12 plus, many of us, years of the educational system, and we believe things about ourselves that aren't true. And if we believe things about ourselves that aren't true, we know the immigrants believe things about us that isn't true, and we know the average, everyday, common white person believes, many of them believe things about us that just aren't true. Brother Hakeem, let me ask you one more question before just one question. You know, I looked at your bio and I saw that at a young age, you seem to have your path set. You knew what you were going to do, despite living in an area like South Side Chicago. The image that we are given in media is that if you live somewhere like South Side Chicago, Detroit, LA, Liberty City, in Miami, places like this, you come up in a single family home, you don't have any direction, you're bad in school, you're failing, you don't know what you're going to do, you're lost in drugs and 40 ounces. Well, how is it that you live in type of environments, but you turned out the way you turned out?
So the Quran very clearly teaches that Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is inside of themselves. It is true that there's an impact that your environment has on your behavior, on your life trajectory, but it is not soluted. And it is not something that is deterministic. It is something that, as a Muslim, I believe wholeheartedly that if we change the condition inside of ourselves, we will see our environment start to change. And of course, you have good examples of people who have been able to escape the conditions of the ghetto. Malcolm X, El Hajj Malik
Mm,
El Shabazz being a very good example for myself. So it comes down to the Quran, it comes down to the Sunnah. These, these, this theology, religion of Islam is a beautiful religion, and
mhm.
it's one of the reasons why oppressors fear Islam because of the impact that it can have in terms of uplifting the moral fiber of a people, giving them hope, escape, and to rise above very desolate conditions.
Mm. It reminds me of the quote from Malcolm himself, where he said, what means that Islam was the thing that he saw could resolve the race issue in America. Now, on page 3 of your book, let me read a quote. The irony of the blacks are just looking for a handout myth is that the white community has benefited directly from various government policies that have enabled them to accumulate wealth and prosper at the expense of black Americans. That struck me because, you know, probably since the time of Ronald Reagan, probably before that, going back to Nixon, there's been this since the switch of the Democrat and Republican parties, the Southern strategy, as some people call it. There's been this running theme that of black single mothers being dependent on wealth, black men not stepping up to be fathers and allowing the women and the children to live off the dime of the government and the taxpayer. And if I live in the suburbs, why do I have to pay taxes to support these people? But this quote completely challenges that whole entire narrative, saying that the blacks looking for a handout is a myth. In fact, the way things have played out is that white America has benefited from government programs. Can you explain that to us a little bit more?
Sure, brother. When we look at America and its history of policy from the very inception, you had bills such as the GI Bill, you had the Homestead Act. These policy initiatives gave white Americans access to land that people were systematically barred from obtaining. These programs allowed white people to establish themselves, to have homes in order to build transgenerational wealth. Black people were excluded from these very programs. Most wealth in this country is passed on via inheritance. Inheritance and the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next, that plays a larger role in one's social economic status than, especially when we look at the wealth gap between blacks and whites, than any other. And so the irony of saying that black people are relying on handouts, and I discuss this further in the book, black people have undertaken through their own initiative, through their own persevering spirit, and through their own ingenuity, efforts to be self-sufficient and to be self-sustaining. And when black people have embarked on these initiatives, the government, far from giving black people a handout, has used their hands in order to usurp what Black Americans through their own initiatives were establishing. And so the book gives several examples of this. Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was filled with great black entrepreneurial minds in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They had their own business enterprises, and it was a very economically prosperous situation for Black Americans in creating Black Wall Street. What happened? The KKK, various white supremacist organizations, including those of law enforcement, the state had a hand in committing arson and completely destroying this very successful, very thriving Black community. When we look at Marcus Garvey movement, the great Marcus, they call him Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Marcus Garvey's in the United Negro Improvement Association. It was all about people doing for themselves, establishing their own businesses, and he was very successful at this. What happened as a result of this? Again, the government, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI worked to thwart his program in order to completely deplete what he was doing and for the African American people and for Black people abroad. When we look at organizations such as the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party, when they saw that there was a situation of poverty in the Black community, they established breakfast programs, they established hospital medical clinics for the Black community. And what happened as a result of this? The Chicago Police Department, it has been revealed, went right into where the Black Panther Party was operating their free breakfast programs, and they would urinate on the food that was being given to Black people. They took every effort in order to create conflicts within the Black Panther Party and destroy and decimate the Black Panther Party. So far from Black people relying on the government for a handout, the government instead would use its hands to thwart Black economic initiative. And another example of this is the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam operated several very prosperous businesses within the Black community. They had their own fishing industries, a wide variety of banks, of schools, and the COINTELPRO documents are very clear as to the government's role in working to destroy the economic infrastructure of the Nation of Islam. And of course, they played a role in creating tensions around the assassination and the events that unfolded into the assassination of Brother Malcolm X. So the government has played a very integral role in destroying efforts that Black people have made to economically be self-sustaining and self-sufficient. So far from Black people relying on the government for the handout, it is the exact opposite. It is the government who is using its hands to destroy Black economic self-sufficiency as well as Black economic initiative.
Hmm. Now, touching on the what you said about housing and home ownership, this I think is common knowledge that a lot of the wealth in America, at least for the average person, is accumulated in home ownership and is passed down generationally, through home ownership. Now, the average person can't go out and just buy a house. You have to be very wealthy to take cash money and buy a house. So you have to get mortgage loans. And, there was a time where you probably had to put down, 20, 30% of your money to get a home, but the government, on page 7 of your introduction, the government established the Federal Housing Administration to underwrite, mortgage companies giving people loans. Uh, Talk a little bit about that in light of what you said. What policies were set up that were discriminatory against Black Americans, and how did those the FHA benefit white America?
Sure. So when it came to the federal government played a very pivotal role in segregating Black Americans and preventing them from home ownership. They had what was called redlining, where whites had greater access to getting loans in order to get houses. And even up into the modern era, they found that Wells Fargo was practicing blanket discrimination against African Americans in terms of when African Americans would try to get a loan for a house, even if they had better qualifications than that of white people, they would be disproportionately subjected to very usurious loans. They would be denied loans in order to obtain a house, and these loans were more readily available to white Americans. In fact, it has been revealed that Wells Fargo was calling Black people mud people. They were calling the loans that they were given to Black people ghetto loans, because these loans would only set them up for foreclosure. In every single way when it came to home ownership, Black people have as faced obstacles that white Americans have not. Another way that the government had a hand in discrimination was through what is called racially restrictive covenants, where entire housing areas would say you cannot sell your homes to Black people. Black people will be prevented by law from purchasing homes. And even after civil rights legislation, the Fair Housing Act, was passed, the studies are very clear that I cite in my book that the Fair Housing Act was an adequate measure in terms of resolving housing discrimination against African Americans, that real estate agents, they would only operate in a more covert manner in order to deny African Americans access to equitable housing. And so this would continue up in the modern era, Black people having obstacles in their place to obtaining home ownership, and white people having a greater access to loan and financial resources in order to obtain the goal of home ownership.
Hmm. And I've seen some stories in the news of, these type of lawsuits and fines being levied against banks recently. This isn't just something, back in the day. It even up into our time, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, even when African Americans have their homes appraised, there's been several very prominent examples in the news media where if someone is having their home appraised to see the value and they're African American, they are quoted very lower rate than that of white Americans. And so the African Americans will have a white person in the house when their home is appraised. They won't be present, and they found that they're given white homes that are presumably owned by whites greater value than homes owned by Black Americans.
Yeah, I think I've seen a story like that. Even a woman, she removed everything from her house that would indicate that African American lived in the house. You know, but it's ridiculous that some people think in 2024 that we're about to go in that Black people should still put up with that. So now some people will say, if we don't like that type of treatment, if we levy lawsuits, and you're a lawyer, this is Black people complaining. You know, why can't just Black people just work hard like the immigrants and work hard like white people? We see. I had someone even put this into one of my comments. What about the Nigerians? You know, they're Black. They just come over and they're killing it. They're working hard to get. Why can't Black people be like them?
So Black people are very hard workers. When it comes to fighting discrimination, when it comes to ending discrimination, that is a fight to be treated equitably, right? If Black people are working hard, white people are the real question is, why are white Americans getting an undeserved boost? Why are they being favored without justification in terms of the loan process to get a house? Why were they historically the only ethnicity that had a greater access to the GI Bill from the benefits of the Homestead Act? These are the real questions that should be asked. Racism is about white people, and white people primarily benefiting from government handouts. This is how we need to look at it. And as opposed to this framing, black people who want to end to their discriminatory treatment, a discriminatory practice that they're being subjected to, instead of them being framed as, well, they just want handouts. So the actuality is the status quo of structural racism is a big handout to white people. And this is why the book, there's a book, the book that I wrote, it cites a study on discrimination in employment, where people who have more stereotypically white sounding names, they are preferred in terms of the job application process. This is a handout to white Americans. They're getting boosted and having more access to economic prosperity and opportunities for economic mobility than that of Black Americans. And so it's not an issue of, yes, Black people should take action. And in fact, taking action to their discriminatory treatment, this is not mere complaining. This is taking action. Black people should be action oriented. We should call attention to the discriminatory treatment that we have historically faced in the American society that continues to this very day.
That was a very good point. That, raising these lawsuits, protesting, calling out this discrimination is taking action. So the attempt to it's almost like it's a gaslighting to reframe our action that we're taking as quote unquote complaining. And that question is that was actually asked to me in a comment for a post that I put on my page. And I pointed out to the person, yes, some Nigerians are good, doing good, but immigration is very selective. Nigeria has a lot of poverty as well, and America is not letting everybody from Nigeria come into America. And we just saw not too long ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, the young man, he was Ralph Yarl, I think that was his last name. He was the young man who he was picking up his sister and brother and went to the wrong door, and a elderly white man shot through the door and came outside and shot him again. He didn't stop and ask him, "Are you African American or are you Nigerian?" He shot him because he had a black face. So, simply being, that whole argument falls down in many different ways, many different ways.
Yeah, sure. And,
Um,
and
go ahead.
to add to that, brother, you're absolutely correct that America does practice what is called selective immigration, where they only allow cream of the crop to enter into the country. Nigeria has its own set of social problems that emanate from European colonialism and contemporary neo-colonialism to this very day. They also have the impact of structural racism in their own Nigerian society as well as colonialism. And so the practice of selective immigration, allowing a few cream of the crop Nigerians into this country and people pointing to their prosperity, their financial success, their industriousness to impugn the character and the dignity of the African American community. This is extremely misplaced, especially when we look at the very unique circumstances that African Americans have had to endure and continue to endure that are not visited upon not just the Nigerian immigration population, because this argument is made in terms of a wide variety of immigrant groups. Look at Indian Americans, look at Asian minorities, look how they're succeeding. What other group has had to endure centuries of slavery, who had laws written in the book that said you cannot read a book? You will be subjected to corporal punishment, to flogging, if you just pick up a book to read. These are laws written in the books to inhibit the education of Black people. And then
Mm.
after the quote unquote end of slavery, being subjected to Jim Crow laws that were in every facet of American society that to regulate and confine the social mobility of African Americans. And through it all, African Americans are still persevering. African Americans continue to overcome the odds, to be hardworking, to set up thriving communities from Black Wall Street, as I mentioned, to establish very successful movement. This continues to this very day. So the immigrant argument is extremely erroneous in terms of its application, because it assumes that these immigrants have been subjected to the same social factors, to the same discrimination as African Americans. And this is simply not the case. They did not have to endure Jim Crow laws and as well as other discriminatory legislation that Black people have had to endure. And in fact, it is the African Americans who have struggled against these systems of structural racism that even allowed for them to be in the country to begin with. And they are benefiting from the struggle of the African American people. And so I would humbly say to people, to immigrant populations who want to look at the problems in urban inner city ghettos and just think to themselves, oh, why can't they just make it the way that we have? I would humbly say to you all are benefiting from the struggle of the African American people.
Mm, mm. So, okay, maybe not the immigrant, but we see Black people on TV. I mean, today is Sunday. I'm taping this, so it's NFL Sunday. And brother, we know who runs the NFL, what type of faces what bodies you're gonna see black bodies tonight when you watch Sunday Night Football, and these are multimillionaires. These brothers are making all this money, and you got billionaire rappers like Jay-Z and Diddy, of all people, who's been in the news for other things, and Oprah Winfrey. She's being celebrated. The Purple has been re-released. Aren't all these black faces and black bodies that we see in the media of black people who are killing it, black excellence? Isn't this proof that things have really changed since the civil rights legislation? There isn't really a wealth gap. Black people are really getting ahead in the nation and turned the corner.
Brother, let me give you the following analogy. Imagine there was a skyscraper, and there was an earthquake that had decimated the skyscraper. And in the skyscraper at the time of the earthquake was over 100 people. And after the earthquake, they did an analysis into the skyscraper, and they determined that it was built with a very faulty structure. However, because two people managed to survive this earthquake and they were inside of the skyscraper, someone tries to dispute the findings of the architect, saying, how can you say that this skyscraper was built in a faulty manner when there were two people who survived? Yes, there continues to be very exceptional African Americans who, through their own, whether it be athletic prowess, whether it be their own entrepreneurial spirit, that continue to overcome the incredible odds that have been stacked against the African American people, have been managed through their own ingenuity or even just fortune to overcome these odds. But this does nothing to dispute the large body of evidence that makes it abundantly clear that racism pervades every facet of American society, from access to opportunities for employment, access to adequate housing, access to being treated justly and not being harassed and pulled over unjustly by the police. Even Black people at higher ends of the socioeconomic status, they continue to be subjected to police harassment. I mean, what was it? Biggie Smalls who said, the more money we come across, the more problems we see. So even Black people, higher socioeconomic classes, they face racism. And so I think the real question is, how much more successful would these Black people be if racism was not a factor inhibiting them from reaching their full potential, as opposed to just looking at a few examples of very successful African Americans and saying, well, this large body of evidence showing that American society is a racist class society. What we should instead be doing is asking ourselves, how much more successful and economically prosperous would these African Americans be if they had not had to overcome the obstacles of racism that was put in their path to inhibit them from progressing. And we also have to ask ourselves, look at the incompetent, unintelligent white people who are in positions of power and positions of wealth. Look at individuals like George W. Bush. Look at individuals like Donald Trump. These individuals, they have assumed high positions of political power. They have large amounts of wealth. They're not intelligent people. You cannot say that they're more hardworking than the average Americans. This is a direct result of their white privilege that they've been able to into these positions of wealth and in these positions of power, not their intelligence, not their work initiative, not their work ethic. And this is, I think, a fundamental reality that white people need to know. White people, they love to delude themselves. White people, they're very delusional in the sense that many of them think, oh, I'm in my place of society because of my work ethic. I worked hard.
Pulling up by
This
the
is
bootstrap.
why this is why I'm in where I am in society. And so when we talk about race inhibiting the social mobility of Black people, they see it as an attack against them. And when we add in reality, no, you're in white America. You are not where you are in terms of your wealth, in terms of your employment, due to your hard work, due to your, well, that may have played a factor. I'm not going to entirely discount it, but without a doubt, you receive a benefit from racism in the American society. You did not have to go through and endure all of the obstacles that African Americans have had to endure, and that has given you a boost.
Mhm. Yes. And let me just read this this quote on page 24 in relation to the question I asked you. The Federal Reserve and Department of Health and Human Services conducted surveys that reveal the likelihood of achieving this type of wealth based on race. For African Americans, the chances of reaching Oprah's level of prosperity are less than 6.4%, while for white Americans, it's upwards of 21.5%. Ain't that something?
Yes, and
So a white
again,
person has a greater chance of being like Oprah than a black person.
absolutely, and again, there's also a study that was cited in the book that demonstrates how most wealth in American society is passed on through inheritance. What is inheritance? You happen to be born in a family that has wealth, that has money, and you're able to pass it on from one generation to the next. This is not as a result of your work ethic, as a result of your own hardworking spirit or your ingenuity. You just happen to be born into a family that had wealth and can pass it on. Look at and then when we look at how most wealth is passed on through inheritance, we have to look at all of the opportunities that white America has had to build wealth that Black people did not have access to. From the GI Bill, the Homestead Act, and prior to that, the entire history of slavery. The entire history of slavery was white people benefiting from free labor from Black people. They were able to establish corporations, major corporations in the United States, from Chase Bank. All of these corporations benefited very heavily from slavery and were able to pass on that wealth from one generation to the next.
That leads me into another anti-black trope you address in your book. Because some people will say, well, you brung up inheritance. Inheritance isn't just, Donald Trump, George Bush level inheritance. As we said, housing, owning homes and passing it down is one of the most common ways of wealth being passed down. So the average everyday person who receives, when their parents die, they take ownership of a house. They take ownership of cars. There's a life insurance policy in place that pays not only pays for the funeral, but there's money left over. That particular house can be turned into rental property that brings residual money into that person's pocket. And a lot of African Americans, because we're behind the eight ball, we're just not receiving that type of inheritance and that type of wealth generating power. So that on one part of your book, you talk about black people's supposed poor spending habits. 'Cause that's a trope. Even among us, this is why I said at the beginning, we believe things about us that aren't even true. So even in the black community, I hear this. Black people, we got all this spending, we got billions of dollars of spending power. Black people get a bit of money, all they're gonna do is go buy a Cadillac. You're gonna go take a trip to Vegas and blow all the money. You're not gonna invest it. You're not gonna do this. Is that there's validity to that?
Brother, this is a conservative tall tale. This is a myth that, unfortunately, as you mentioned, even Black people believe about themselves, although it is commonly seen in the media. And this is another thing. Many people, they get their stereotypes and their perceptions about African Americans from the media. They may see a rapper blow a bunch of money at a strip club and think that this is somehow a common thing among the African American community. There is absolutely no evidence at all that white Americans have better spending habits than Black Americans. And in fact, in many ways, as I demonstrated in my book, African Americans are more fiscally responsible than that of white Americans. There is no evidence to substantiate the notion that African Americans are just blowing their money in mass on entertainment, on jewelry. These are all stereotypes that are promoted in the media, but there's no empirical evidence to substantiate it. Should African Americans be wiser in how they spend their money? Yes. Should African Americans look into ways that we as a community can pull our resources together in a more wise manner in order to better sustain ourselves? Absolutely. However, lack of quality or good spending habits is absolutely not responsible for the disproportionate poverty in African American communities. The blame and the cause of poverty in the Black American community is white supremacy. It is racism. It is the history of slavery. It is the history of Black people being denied equitable access to economic opportunities. So this is a myth that has no validity at all, and we should stop spreading this myth about the African American community.
Mm. Going into police brutality, this is another thing that's put out there, that Black people are complaining about police brutality. In reality, police brutality is that's not something that happens on a regular basis. You know, Black on Black crime is a bigger issue, police brutality. Also, if Black people would just cooperate, you know, if you just cooperated when the police pull you over and they start searching you and you do all this stuff, it wouldn't really be a problem. So are Black people just complaining about an imaginary problem?
Absolutely not. And here's the thing, most people, for example, I've heard several conservative pundits, they will say things like, "Oh, a Black person is more likely to be struck by lightning than they are to be killed by the police." Here's the reality. Police brutality is not limited to these high-profile cases of police homicides against Black Americans. However, and in fact, it is ubiquitous in terms of how African Americans are disproportionately subjected to illegal searches. Police officers are more likely to subject Black Americans to very harassing, very privacy intrusive searches than that of white Americans. This is also a part of police brutality. African Americans, they are also more likely to be subjected to excessive force, regardless of whether it leads to a homicide or not. African Americans are more likely to be subjected to excessive force. I cite a variety of psychological studies in my book that did studies on white police officers, and these white police officers, they were more likely to misidentify a weapon or an object belonging to an African American as being that of a firearm or a weapon than that of white Americans who are also holding similarly situated objects. The psychological studies are also clear that police officers, they would react in a more violent manner against African Americans than that of white Americans. There's studies on body camera footage that shows and demonstrates conclusively that police officers, they use more respectful language when interacting with white Americans than they do Black Americans. They exhibit more restraint. They're more patient when they interact with white Americans than that of Black Americans. And this is all part of this system of police brutality that is ubiquitous throughout the United States. But now, here's the question, right? So, and this is the question that the book responds to. Conservatives, they will say, look at all that gang violence in Chicago, and you're focused on the police shootings, these isolated cases of police shootings, when you all have the Bloods and the Crips, or you have the GDs and the BDs. And here's the answer to that question. Both crime within the Black community and police brutality, they both emanate from the same source, which are the conditions of structural racism. How is this the case? So the sociologists are able to identify social conditions that they say are crimogenic, causing crime. There's a good book on this subject called Criminality in Context that looks at how social conditions can breed what are called crimogenic factors, factors that lends itself to facilitating crime. Now, they've also, the book also cites several studies that looks at how redlining has been very strongly correlated with firearm violence. Neighborhoods that have been redlined, those very neighborhoods where the individuals were denied loans, or where they put a red dot and said you cannot sell people from these neighborhoods, you cannot give these individual loans to buy houses. The very neighborhoods that were subjected to segregation, that had a variety of barriers put in place for the economic prosperity. These are the neighborhoods that have higher levels of firearm violence, and there is a direct causal impact between structural racism facilitating crimogenic conditions in the black community. So the brother, the brainwashed black brother who decides to join a gang, he has been living in a neighborhood that has been redlined. He's living in a neighborhood wherein the school system does not have adequate funding in order to sustain itself. He's living in a neighborhood where there are very few job opportunities, and this facilitates crimogenic conditions that make a underground economy or a criminal lifestyle more appealing and more lucrative than individuals who have not endured structural racism and thus are not living in these crimogenic conditions. And so both police brutality and what they call from black crime, these both emanate from structural racism. But we also need to point this out, which is because when conservatives make this talking point, they want to try to promote the idea that black people are irresponsible, that, oh, we're just focusing on police killings and police this, police that, but we aren't taking accountability of the violence in our own neighborhoods. And this is a baseless myth, a baseless myth. There, black people, African Americans, the crimogenic conditions in their neighborhood that emanate from structural racism. There's been a wide variety of grassroots initiatives, and the list is mentioned in the book, where black people who have been at the forefront of challenging gang violence in my community. I run a program called Uplift Your Brother, where we work with brothers who were former members of Chicago gang, and now they're serving life sentences in prison, but they have taken the Shahada, they've become Muslim, and now we're working with these brothers so they can challenge the allure and the appeal of street life. And I'm one of many, one of many. So black people do take efforts to fight against crime in their community, and the Muslims have been at the forefront of that.
Mm, mm. Now, recently in the news, we see Rudy Giuliani just recently lost a civil lawsuit, and he's famously tied with stop and frisk. So, what about the argument that, so places like Chicago or New York and places like you need stop and frisk because we know black men in particular you commit so much crime, and stop and frisk would bring down crime. It wouldn't stop and frisk help Southside Chicago?
There's been no empirical study that has demonstrated stop and frisk was effective in reducing crime. Instead, it only facilitated the illegal searches of African Americans. And so, as a crime fighting policy, as any sort of policy, it completely failed. If you want to talk about ending gang violence in the black community, if you want to talk about ending the drug economy in the black community, what that's going to take is very strong effort, of course, within the African American community, to challenge the conditions of structural racism that makes viable career paths, viable opportunities for economic prosperity, for employment, very, very difficult. And so, when it comes to, if you want to talk about a crime fighting policy, let's talk about redressing the conditions in communities that have been facilitated by structural racism. And yes,
Mhm.
we need grassroots initiatives. We need to be working with brothers on the block. We need to be showing them how their life trajectory is bad. We as Muslims need to be involved in this. We as a black community in general need to be involved in grassroots initiatives to fight crime in our community, to give brothers who are involved in crime other avenues and other outlets in life. But as part of that struggle, we have to address structural racism. We have to address structural
Definitely.
racism because it inhibits access to employment. It inhibits access to economic opportunities, all of which make crime a less conducive a career path than that of stop and frisk. So no, stop and frisk was not an effective crime fighting policy. It did
Mm,
nothing to fight crime. Yes, they would harass black people. They may, and in fact, many times, there's been a study on wrongful convictions and wrongful arrests that found that
mm,
police are more the African Americans. Not only are they more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a crime, but police improprieties play a larger role in their false arrest, in their wrongful conviction. Police perjury, police planting evidence on African Americans illegally. So, no, stop and
okay,
frisk is not an effective crime fighting policy.
definitely. And we're running up on an hour. So with this last few minutes, we've seen a lot about CRT, and there were protests everywhere talking about we don't want CRT in the school system. We don't want this woke indoctrination. What is CRT, and should people, especially Muslims, because I've seen a particular Muslim who wrote a article, a book or something about CRT, trying to warn the African American, the Muslim community against CRT. Is the CRT is the big bad dragon of wokeness that the people are
So,
telling us.
when white Americans say they don't want critical race theory taught in school, they're operating with a definition of critical race theory that is extremely ignorant. They don't even know what critical race theory is. It's sort of like the new, what they call the new red scare. They don't want critical race theory taught in school. They don't even have a proper a definition or a proper understanding of what critical race theory even is. And this is why even very basic fundamental things have been painted as critical race theory. So, for example, teaching Black history, teaching about the history of racism in American society, teaching that white people, due to their white skin, are gain unearned privileges within American society. These are all viewpoints that are in conformity with critical race theory, but in and of themselves are not how academia in and of itself would define or delineate critical race theory. So white America, as they have always been, they're against any serious effort to confront racism. They're against any serious effort to acknowledge racism. And this is why you see these conservatives saying we don't want this taught in school. We don't want this influencing our children. This is the real reason. But to answer your question, what is critical race theory? There was a very great African American attorney. His name was Derek Bell. Derek Bell fought vigorously to end segregation of African Americans in school. He was part of the NAACP. He worked under Thurgood. He initially worked under the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund that was headed by Thurgood Marshall, the great African American attorney. And Derek Bell worked endlessly and tirelessly to stop the segregation of African Americans in school. However, as his career would progress all the way into the 80s, what he discovered and what he indeed found was that African Americans continued to be segregated in schooling, despite the passage of Brown versus Board of Education, despite the Supreme Court decision that stated African Americans should not be segregated in school, that's separate but equal, separate, that this was unconstitutional, Brown versus Board of Education, that this failed to alleviate the segregation of African Americans in schooling. And so Derek Bell began to very critically look at the civil rights movement, the civil rights legislation. And what he found was that African Americans continue to be subjected to racial discrimination, not just in education, but in other facets of American society, despite the Brown versus Board education decision. And so Derek Bell, he sort of conceived this critical race theory as being a critique of civil rights legislation and its inability to resolve structural racism in the United States. And he built an academic movement based upon this that later got the name of critical race theory. And it was a critique of the failure of civil rights legislation to resolve the issue of structural racism within the United States. Now, of course, white Americans, and it should also be clear that, brother, did you know that there are polls that show that during the height of Jim Crow laws, white Americans, when they were polled, would say that they believe Black Americans were being treated fairly in society?
Yes,
This was
I
in the
read it in your
50s.
book.
Yeah, yeah. This was in the 50s and in the 50s and in the 60s when they would ask, "How do you think are African Americans being treated fairly in American society?" They would say Yes, they are. They would say that Dr. Martin Luther
Hmm,
King is doing too much. They had a
mm,
white Americans in large had a very negative opinion of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so it shouldn't be
mm,
surprising that they're protesting in mass against critical race theory, but it is a shame and it is a travesty that you find Muslims who say that they believe in the Quran, Muslims who say that they believe in Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who in his farewell sermon condemned racism, condemned attitudes of racial superiority, who are joining in with these inept especially these inept and incompetent arguments against critical race theory. It's a travesty. And of course, critical race theory, like any academic enterprise, it can be subjected to critiques. There may be a different fault in a particular, article of a critical race theorist. So it's not like this is beyond a critique, but the very arguments that Muslims have been making against critical race theory, they're parroting the very talking point of white Americans that are not valid, any sort of, not only not a valid critique of critical race theory, but not even a valid, their critiques do not even show that they know what critical race theory even is.
mm, mm. Jazakallah khair. What you've heard today, people, is it's just a taste of information. I strongly suggest that you, after you get done watching this, go to Amazon and get the book In Defense of Black America. It'll be worth the money that you pay for it, and you can read in detail what you've heard here today and a whole lot more that we didn't even get a chance to get into. Thank you very much, brother, for coming and enlightening my audience today.
Thank you very much, bro, for having me on. I really appreciate it. And may Allah bless you and all the work that you're doing in this wonderful podcast.
I mean, and you too.